Hello everyone, this is Matt Curfman with the Richmond Brothers here for the January 2020 edition of Matt's Minutes. Thanks for tuning in. Well, the last day of the month ended unfortunately in negative territory, largely because of the concern around the viral outbreak in China and how that could ripple across global markets. So we did end the month on a negative note, but I would just add some context to that. From a purely market perspective, I think it's okay that the market basically takes a pause. We've seen a little bit into February, some positive days coming out of the end of January. But when a market is growing, it's actually healthy for it to take a step back, take a pause, and there's going to always be some things going on that could affect future growth. That said, we think economically, earnings are still pretty strong from corporations. Unemployment's really low. A lot of these leading indicators are still rather strong. And it sounds like the Federal Reserve, if need be, would be ready to potentially lower rates again, which would be a stimulus to the markets. So again, these are all just kind of as we look into the first half of 2020. So I would almost look at the viral outbreak and go back in history to the most recent that I could come up with was SARS in 2003, and even more recently the Zika virus. If you look at the impact on markets or how much time it took for world governments and World Health Organizations to basically figure out how to manage that and deal with it and help those people who are affected, the Zika virus affected markets for about 2 months. It kind of added some choppiness. The SARS back in 2003 was about 5 weeks. So I think that's, just for some perspective. Obviously, there's some larger health concerns and some people that have been affected in their families. So, thoughts and prayers certainly out to those families. But I did want to let you know how that could or how it might affect market conditions and ultimately your portfolios. So with January closing a negative month, statistically now going into the next 11 months, there's still an 80% chance or likelihood that the markets will continue to gain grounds and have a positive year. Now, if we look at what happens in those next 11 months, probably a few things are now behind us that a month ago I couldn't have said. I would say that largely we're not going to see nearly as much back and forth as far as trade wars and tariffs. It's not completely out of the picture, but it seems to have mellowed out a little bit. And then secondly, this is not a political statement, but its impact on the market. Early in February, the possibility of a presidential impeachment is behind us. So purely from how would the market respond, I think that was a big uncertainty heading into this year. March and then November are kind of big dates for the presidential election cycle, so the primaries and the Super Tuesday. I think coming out of that, we should have a pretty clear idea of who kind of the front-running candidates are. And then what we'll do on your behalf is try to watch what some of their policies are. And so between March and November, depending on who kind of is in the lead, we may want to make some slight adjustments to some equity portions within your portfolio. For example, the defense sector. Right now, defense spending is very strong. And if there's a candidate that looks like could be heading to the White House who doesn't have the same policy that our current president has with defense spending, we may not want to own that sector. So just as an illustrative example. So we'll keep an eye on that. We don't think there needs to be any major shifts as far as portfolios or allocations at the moment. And then I thought I'd add an education piece. We've just passed into 2020. And many of you saw Dan Vredeveld's short video on the Secure Act passing and what are the key takeaways. So now that we're actually into 2020, we've got quite a few questions on required minimum distributions, stretch IRAs, so I thought I'd just touch on those. If you turned 70 and a half years old in 2019, so by December 31st, you still need to basically follow the old rules and continue your annual required minimum distributions using the life expectancy table that's already published. If you didn't turn 70 and a half and by January 1st of 2020 and you're going to turn 70 and a half sometime this year, then you're in a group that basically and effectively gets to defer required minimum distributions out to the ripe age of 72, so a year and a half deferral. So just so we have some clarity there. And then the other thing I would say, just for additional education, is many people now, when we talk about setting up beneficiaries on your accounts, and especially if it's kids, grandkids, siblings, nieces, nephews, anyone who's a non-spouse beneficiary is typically going to find now that if they were to inherit a retirement account, whether it's an IRA, a Roth, a 401k, that 10 years after the death of the owner, the entire account needs to be liquidated, as opposed to before, it stretches out over the beneficiary's life expectancy. So it creates some interesting planning tools, and I will note that if you already have a beneficiary IRA from before December of 2019, you still follow the old rules and get to keep the same formulas of stretching over your life expectancy. It's really for new inheritance retirement accounts in 2020 and beyond follow these new rules. So with that, there's probably a lot of creative planning that's going to come out of this, and you've heard for years us talk about Roth IRAs. So again, I'll pivot into that and then I'll close for this month. But a lot of confusion around Roth IRAs, Roth 401ks, Roth 403bs, and then IRA to Roth conversions. Well, basically what you're really doing with anything is a Roth IRA is an account that's outside of your work plan, and the IRS can set income restrictions. So the IRS can say you make too much money, therefore you're not eligible to contribute to this account. Now what's totally different from that, even though it's the same word, is if you have a work plan and you're in a Roth 401k, for example, or a Roth 403b, we're still using the word Roth, but inside of that work plan umbrella, there are no income limitations. So to be extreme, you can make $1 million a year, and in a work plan, the IRS can't say you make too much money and you can't contribute. So if you're under 50, there's a limit of $19,500. And that's the annual contribution that you could be making to your Roth 401k regardless of income, and yet out here you could be restricted. So for those of you that are already retired and say, well, I don't have earned income, I can't make contributions to Roth, there's still a lot of planning to be done with the consideration of IRA to Roth conversions. Now what you're effectively doing is choosing to pay tax now so that that money sits in the account, and down the road, if tax rates were to accelerate in 10 years, for example, you have a separate bucket of retirement assets that have already been taxed at a lower rate, and now they are income tax free to you. And with the Secure Act, if you were to pass away, that Roth passes to your beneficiaries, and while it still has to be paid out in 10 years, after your passing, it is also an income tax free asset to your beneficiaries. So if you have any questions on that, or if there are other educational topics that you'd like me to make sure and build into the Matt's Minutes this year, if you would follow up and just send those to questions@richmondbrothers.com, we'd be happy to consolidate those. And then again, every month add some educational topics into this. And so if you would just put in the subject line, Matt's Minutes Education, and we'll know to basically pull those out. So as always, any questions, comments, thoughts, please feel free to reach out to us. 517-435-4040 or questions@richmondbrothers.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful start to your year.